right, greetings. Welcome to Kingdom Leadership Institute. I'm Dr. Don Lynch, and this is our Wolf Seminar, Identifying and Dealing with Wolves. And we'll be here every Tuesday night, 3 hours, 7 to 10 Eastern Standard Time. And thank you for tuning in and participating. Please send in questions. I want our discussion to be thorough. And for you to have some class participation in identifying and dealing with wolves. And immediately we began speaking about wolves and identifying, dealing with them. We, of course, step into a scriptural metaphor. So let's begin with an understanding of what a metaphor is, a simile. It's a way of saying something is like something else. The Bible's full of metaphors in which we are described as sheep, but we don't actually have wool. And so there are characteristics of human behavior that resemble sheep behavior, and the parallel between those two is as limited. In other words, the simile or the metaphor only applies in that range. It doesn't mean that we carry the metaphor out too far, because then we'll miss the point. It means we only look at what is like, what human behavior is like sheep behavior, what human behavior is like wolf behavior, as is being discussed by Jesus, by Paul, by Simon Peter, and then some other leaders who describe the same behavior in the Bible, but they don't use sheep or wolf, because they're describing it without the metaphor. And we'll be careful to talk about all of those things. Now, we are writing a book, and the book is going to have an exegesis, what people call commentary, but exegesis is more than that. So I'm going to go through all of the New Testament comments and discussions, and in the book I'm going to describe them fully. But sometime in our third or fourth session together, I am going to just open the scripture and talk. Here's what Jesus says about wolves. Here's what Paul says about wolves. Here's what Simon, Peter, Jude, and John say about wolves and wolves' behavior. But we want to be extremely biblical in what we're talking about, because it is a metaphor. It's not a prophetic image. It's a metaphor. So in other words, you might have a prophetic word about wolf behavior that wouldn't line up with the specific way that the metaphor speaks about shepherd, sheep, and wolf. Now, here in Kingdom Leadership Institute, we have a course called Apostolic Shepherding, and what we mean by that is when the fivefold ministry functions, we have apostle, prophet, teacher, evangel, and shepherd. Translated pastor in your King James Version. It's the only time the word pastor appears in the entire Bible. But the word is shepherd. We just stopped using the word shepherd because we didn't like the shepherding movement of the previous century, and people just didn't like that word anymore. But the Bible uses the word shepherd, and I don't think we should allow any of the error of the past to steal the word from the Bible, mislabel it or misconstrue it or give it a different meaning. So I'm just going to stick with the Bible. It's a shepherd. And so we have a shepherd, we have sheep, and we have a wolf. But of course, the shepherd and the sheep are all humans, and so is the wolf. So what we're looking for is the metaphor, what part of the behavior, what part of the leader is being referred to in the simile. And so as we understand that, we understand what these biblical authors mean, what Jesus means when he speaks of the wolf. And through this metaphor, we learn how to identify the sources of the outward behaviors, because the wolves have a certain behavior, and the way we identify it is by discerning the inward motivation. Now, a metaphor never walks on all fours. What I mean by that idiom is that you can't make the metaphor do too much, or else you'll get into error, because Jesus has a very specific message. Paul has a very specific message. And in fact, when Jesus speaks of the good shepherd, speaking of himself. He's not talking about the same thing that Paul's talking about when he says to the elders in Ephesus that they're being asked to take care of or to shepherd the flock of God. So the metaphor doesn't even, it isn't the same metaphor in the same application, because Jesus said, I'm the good shepherd, but I'm also the gate of the sheepfold. So he says, I'm a shepherd and a gate. So in other words, you can see that you can't make the metaphor walk on all fours, because a shepherd can't be a gate, and he can't be a gate and shepherd at the same time. So it's metaphoric language, and this is very common with the Bible, very common with Jesus, and it's going to be very clear. In other words, he's saying, let me describe something spiritual, but to make it easily understood or make it understandable for you, I'm going to say, well, this spiritual thing is like something natural. And of course, in the days of Jesus, talking about shepherds and sheep and wolves was to talk about something as common as cars and McDonald's are to us. We don't live, all of us, in an agricultural setting, and many of us never have shepherded sheep or been around sheep. It's not common to us, but in Jesus' day, every region had its own flock, and it had shepherds, and it had a sheepfold in which everybody's sheep, you could bring everybody's sheep from the whole region into one fold to protect it from wolves, because you put sheep in the fold at nighttime. And so often, in fact, in the days of Jesus, the shepherds were the lowest, the most common, the people who couldn't get a job doing anything else, but they could stay up all night. And, sheep that are already secured in a sheepfold then could be watched or protected by a shepherd, and it wasn't a high-skilled job. However, in the metaphor, we see that Jesus elevates the shepherd, and he says, I'm the good shepherd. Well, and then Paul elevates the aspect of shepherd as it applies to eldering leaders. And Simon Peter says the same thing about God's people being a flock. And as we explain in apostolic shepherding, sheep is a behavior, wolf is a behavior, shepherd is a leadership behavior, a role and leadership behavior. So we are not all sheep in the sense that we're supposed to remain with sheep behavior. In the kingdom of God, there are people who have sheep behavior and they need a shepherd, but there are other people who need to become warriors, not sheep. And so the metaphor doesn't walk on all fours. And if we attempt to make it walk on all fours, we are going to get into error, and we're going to have a less of an understanding of what the Bible is explaining to us about how to recognize sheep, how to recognize shepherds and sheep and shepherd behavior, and how to recognize the wolf. People are metaphorically introduced in the Bible as sheep, to be led by God, to be led by prophets, to be led by kings, to be led by kingdom leaders. And all of those types of leaders are spoken as shepherds, when in fact David shepherded the people as a king and as a general and as a ruler and as a warrior, as a worshiper, because the metaphoric sense of it doesn't walk on all fours. So when we step into the metaphor, understand that it will be the metaphor that helps us understand more about what we're talking about in terms of identifying wolves. And if we don't get the metaphor right, we're not going to be ready. We're not going to be right in anything that we say. So welcome to the seminar. Those of you that are still checking in and or on Facebook Live, which most of you are. There's some here live with me here at Freedom House. But feel free to ask questions, make comments, and join in. Many of you have not yet become students, so let me encourage you to become a student of Kingdom Leadership Institute. And our role in training is much different, rather unique, in that we are seriously training people who can do what kingdom leaders do. We are not in theory, but we are in practice. So this is an extremely practical course that you're going to be involved in. And I've been in ministry 48 years, and I've never one time in my life heard a seminar training, formal training or informal training on how to identify and deal with wolves. And yet it's, I would suggest, one of the most important aspects of kingdom leadership according to the Bible. So let's right that aspect, let's right the ship. I mean, let's reset the priorities, and let's think the way God thinks, and let's learn how to deal with the hostiles. Shepherds respond with protection and provision for people who have sheep behaviors. And one thing we're going to learn about sheep behavior is that they are woefully inadequate in responding to the behavior of wolves. In fact, as I understand sheep, I'm not a shepherd and I haven't ever had a sheep, but as I've observed, actually I've observed some footage, some video footage of sheep being attacked by wolves and their response, which is to flop on the ground and be eaten. They have no flight, they're not a flight risk, they can't run fast enough. About the only thing they have for protection is thick wool that just makes the job more difficult. But they don't run, and they don't bite, and they don't kick, they don't scream. They just flop and die. And so you can see in a metaphoric sense that it is the weakness of sheep, or sheep who are vulnerable, the vulnerability of people who have sheep behavior. They require shepherds to protect them. And this is, of course, the theme of Jesus. It's the theme of Paul. It's the theme of Simon. It's the theme of Jude and of John, that kingdom leaders have a responsibility for which they are accountable in terms of having blood on their hands, that they are able to identify wolves and deal with wolves, that if they don't, then they are hirelings and they're just in it for the money. If they don't, then they're not good shepherds. If they don't, they have blood on their hands. If they don't, they failed in a very important and significant way to be kingdom leaders who represent Jesus, because Jesus wants somebody to protect his sheep. So another type of sheep and shepherd relationship is presented by another variation of the metaphor. We have the shepherd in the fivefold sense, takes care of sheep who are too simple-minded or too immature to feed themselves and protect themselves. But as we point out in apostolic shepherding, we are to grow out of that. We'll always have people who are so simple-minded that they will require shepherds, because they'll never mature to a point where they can take care of themselves. So spiritually, in the kingdom itself, there will be people who have inadequacies that require continuous shepherding, and the most vulnerable people in the kingdom must be given the attention of every kingdom citizen. We must protect them from wolves as a kingdom culture, but also knowing that there are shepherds specifically assigned because they have a tendency to wander, they have a tendency to starve themselves to death, they have a tendency to just walk in front of a train. I mean, they just don't understand how to walk in security without human leadership. The next aspect is this, that God functions as a shepherd. Jesus is a good shepherd, but we do not have direct shepherding. Now, God's involved in our lives as a father. Jesus is involved in our lives as an intercessor. Holy Spirit lives in us, guides us, teaches us, but the reality is that in every sense, the Bible makes it abundantly clear that we cannot shepherd ourselves. And I'll get to that when we study more about what Jude said about rebels and lawless people who never produce fruit, who are blemishes on our times when we gather together, who are clouds without rain, and who are people to be avoided. And he explains that those people, the characteristic of those people is that they attempt to shepherd themselves. So self-shepherding in the Bible is frowned upon or is seen as a form of lawlessness. Human leadership in this aspect of identifying and dealing with wolves is is an obvious thing or a presupposed thing, a thing presented to kingdom leaders is if you represent Jesus, your job is to risk your own life to save his sheep and not depend on Jesus to do it. I think that we'll also discover maybe in the next session or maybe even tonight that in modern churchianity, we have left it up to sheep to protect themselves. And we have failed to identify wolves or deal with wolves because we have redefined wolf behavior in a way that's inconsistent with the scriptures. So, in the metaphoric sense, Jesus also speaks, and Paul speaks about human leadership in terms of the fivefold, the apostolic, the prophetic, the teacher, the evangel, and the shepherd, all have shepherding aspects. In other words, each one of them in the role of leadership God designed for them, there are aspects of their behavior that are shepherd-like, and there are aspects of the people they lead specifically because they're a prophet or specifically because they're a teacher or the way in which they function with kingdom citizens, that this kingdom elder, this eldering leader, the fivefold ministry, will find themselves needing to protect people from wolf behavior. Now, Jude clarifies in verse 12. I guess we're going to jump right in and here in the introduction. Here's what he says, verse 12. He uses this verb or the action word for shepherding. He said, because you have a shepherd, but he shepherds. That's the activity of the Greek word, and that word nearly always means govern. It most often means govern or lead, and then in a few times it means to shepherd, which means that shepherds govern, and govern they lead, because without leading and governing sheep, you can't protect them. You don't drive them like cattle, you lead them by your voice, but sheep will starve to death without a shepherd. Sheep will just follow one another off a cliff and drown themselves in the sea without a shepherd. In other words, their behavior, and this is spiritual. God is not saying that human beings are stupid or lack intelligence. What he's saying is that in spiritual ways, there are behaviors of sheep that they require leadership. That's why we live in a kingdom, and you can't say that word without king. And then that's why the king is King of Kings, because he has delegated his authority and leadership in order to be represented in the earth by human leaders. So here's what he says. Jude uses this term, and Jude is correcting the infiltration of lawless people. Jude is correcting wolf behavior in general. I mean, he's going to give the entire book of Jude to the fact that even as the first century of the church, the first generation of the church is trying to mature, that it's been infiltrated. And this infiltration is identifying wolves. And he uses the verb, and he said, to speak of rebellious or lawless people. And he says, these people here's a lot of their behaviors, and he lists their behaviors. And then he says, because they self-govern, or they self-lead, or they self-shepherd. And they basically say, as lawless people in the kingdom, they say, I don't need any human leadership. Now, as soon as you say that, then you are a lawless person in the kingdom, because the king is the one who designed kingdom leadership. If you don't like kingdom leadership, you don't like the king. And you don't want to live by kingdom culture because you want to change the king, and you want to change the king to change his culture, and he's not going to do that. In fact, he's asked kingdom leaders to train every kingdom citizen, train them to obey what the king has commanded the leaders. So if you are an attempt to self-shepherd, you're a blemish on our love. That's what he said. Boy, I think I could just stay here and preach for a while. Rainless clouds, blemishes on our love, trees with withered fruit, unwelcomed guests at our tables, twice dead and plucked up by the roots, is what you are if you self-shepherd. He finds it dysfunctional. He finds it abnormal. He finds it unwelcome. He finds it foreign to kingdom culture. So we need shepherds, and shepherds need to function properly, and every kingdom leader has some aspect of his role as a leader which involves this aspect of protecting people from wolves. Now, in this metaphor, in this scenario, we have the wolf. We're all interested in that guy, right? We want to know what he looks like. He's the hostile enemy. Wolf is a behavior. I want to say it right up front that it does not represent all the enemies of sheep. Now, what we're not going to do in this seminar is just identify every enemy of the kingdom as a wolf, because not all the enemies of the kingdom are wolves. Demons are not wolves. They're demons. And everybody that's your enemy is not necessarily a wolf. And so in other words, we have some other things we have to deal with besides wolves. So we don't want to do a hasty generalization and just say, well, every enemy of the sheep's a wolf. No, they're just one aspect of wolf behavior which we can identify, which is specific to behavior of believers who act like sheep. In other words, here's a narrow band of behavior from believers, and wolves, this is a narrow band of behavior of wolves, and the wolf's narrow band of behavior responds to that aspect of sheep. If believers aren't sheep, they're much less vulnerable to wolves. So as we grow them up and mature them, they become warriors, they are much less vulnerable. But even at the highest level, the greatest level, the most mature level, you're always going to need a human leader in your life who can protect you from wolves, because you can't self-shepherd. You need accountability outside of yourself and above yourself in terms of submission. You need to submit to someone who is providing leadership in your life in order to be protected from hostility. Now, the characteristics of a wolf, they respond to the protection part of the metaphor more than the provision. In other words, wolves don't attack sheep by drinking all the water so that sheep die of thirst, They don't attack wolves by eating all the grass, or wolves don't attack sheep by eating the grass so they don't have anything to eat. So the provision side's not where you're going to find the wolf. The wolf is not stealing the sheep's lunch. What's going on with the wolf is he wants to devour. So we're not, shepherds help provide, but it's not the provision side. And this is where the modern evangelical error comes in. Because the modern evangelical error is simply that a wolf is somebody who teaches a doctrine different in mine, and my job of protecting people from wolves is to teach them right. Well, that's the provision, that's the feeding side, and that's not where the danger comes in. Jesus calls wolves false prophets and false teachers, but he's not saying that, if somebody doesn't teach the same doctrine as I do, then I identify them as wolves. Okay? Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons are not the wolves. And the people who don't agree with your doctrine or idolatry are not the wolves. Wolves are different. They function a different way, and the metaphor doesn't fit. When you finish the exegesis and you continue to study what Jesus says, you cannot come to the conclusion that my job as a shepherd is to feed sheep, and then if you feed sheep, they'll be even more attractive to wolves because they like fat sheep. So it's not the provision side. So somewhere along the line, modern evangelicalism, church growthism, we decided that shepherd's job was just to feed, not protect. And so we went to this side where, they're getting the wrong feed, so we're going to feed them this doctrine, and if they get enough of that doctrine, then they won't be hungry for wolves. Sheep are not hungry for wolves. Wolves are hungry for sheep. So the metaphor doesn't work. A wolf actually offers sheep a full diet of poison, if you want to talk the metaphoric sense. You could say that the wolf beguiles sheep with junk food, but that's not really what happens. So the wolf behavior, an enticement is not the problem. The problem with wolves is they devour. And that's going to be our most important aspect of defining wolves, identifying and dealing with wolves, is to understand what it means that wolves consume sheep, because they don't actually eat them. Sheep eat grass, wolves eat meat. And therefore, to understand why sheep dress up in, why wolves dress up in sheep's clothing, we're going to need to understand something about the metaphor, and it's not going to be about what sheep are eating, it's about what sheep are wearing. So let's continue with the metaphoric, what I call the metaphoric mismatch. Because when Jesus explains how to identify wolves, he says, they dress up like sheep. They don't dress up like a shepherd. So, I mean, when you look at the exegesis and you're thinking logical, okay, Jesus, what are you're drawing me a picture, a simile, and you're saying now, this behavior in human beings is like sheep, and this behavior in human beings is like wolves, and this behavior in human leadership is like a shepherd. So beware of the wolves, because they'll come dressed up like sheep. Well, you know, my metaphoric thinking would think they'd show up dressed like shepherds, and then the sheep would follow the wrong person. And Jesus says, no, 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 no. The sheep know your voice. They recognize the voice. That's not the thing that's going to be the problem here. The problem is that they're going to dress up like sheep because they need to smell like sheep. See, discernment is your sense of smell. And what happens with the discerning sheep is that when a wolf dresses like a sheep, he puts on sheep's clothing, he smells like a sheep. Now, he can cover up his big long teeth and all the drool that's coming out of his mouth, but he can't say anything much because it sounds like a wolf. When a wolf growls, it doesn't sound like a sheep. There's no and they don't sound alike. Okay, metaphorically, Jesus says, here's how you identify wolves. They dress up to camouflage themselves. But we learn a lot about the wolf behavior in the natural. We could learn a lot about wolf behavior in the natural without gaining much spiritual insight. In other words, I watched some video of wolves and I watched how they function in packs. But then when I went back and read the words of Jesus and Paul and Jude and John and Simon Peter and the entire scriptures, because I studied sheep behavior in the entire scriptures when I taught apostolic shepherding. So when I studied the metaphor, I understood that studying sheep for hours and hours wasn't going to help me, because it was a narrow band of behavior that was being referred to, not that we actually need to smell like sheep and grow wool and all the sort of things that people say about sheep, because we're really not sheep, we're like sheep. So in what sense are we like sheep, and in what sense are some humans like wolves, and then in what sense are some like shepherds? That's the part we need to identify. So be careful about studying wolf pack behavior, because we don't see the wolf pack behavior in the simile. We don't hear a lot about mating habits and eating habits and habitat considerations, in other words. So we can get carried away here and become experts on natural wolves and miss the whole point. We know this. People are like sheep in these ways. And we have the classic, wolves are the enemy of sheep because sheep have these behaviors. Those behaviors are what make them vulnerable to humans who act like wolves. So what we're going to match up is, how is it that we're like sheep, and how is it that some people are like wolves, and then how is it that leaders are like shepherds in that sense, because we're not all shepherds, and there's a lot more to our leadership than just shepherding. So we start with this basic premise: sheep is a behavior. Now, in the New Testament, so many references to wolves, and there are specific challenges and charges and commands and assignments given to kingdom leaders about wolves, that a seminar on wolves, I would think, I can't imagine you could get a bachelor's degree in ministry if you didn't have one seminar on wolves after reading the Bible. How could you show up someplace And I don't think this is the way you choose pastors anyway, but in modern churchianity, you know, show up and try out to be a pastor, and the deacon board. One of the first questions they should ask you is, what training do you have about wolves? Of course, they're not going to do that because they are wolves. We stopped hunting wolves and started celebrating wolves, and now we want wolves to run the show. And what we do one every week is going to get bad, guys. This is going to get bad. We buy church vans so we can ship sheep to different wolf dens. So it's going to get bad. Because that's the summary when you get done reading the metaphors, what you get is leaders are the ones that act like wolves, and the whole point of their wolf behavior is they want to own some sheep. So this should be required. And in the new era, Reformation, one of the most singular things that need to happen is not only should we have a restoration of kingdom leadership so that we function in the fivefold and understand how Jesus designed and defined leadership, we should also completely renovate and restore our understanding of what a wolf is and what to do with them. Now, if you listen carefully and you're already in a ministry, you may not like this teaching because you may see some wolves that are sitting there staring at you the next time you get up in front of the group of people that you lead. Or you may recognize that you're a wolf yourself. And no, we will not give you a refund on the course. But I have 2 doctorates, and I've got a master's degree, and I've got a bachelor's degree, and I never got any instruction about wolves. Nothing. They just act like they didn't exist, except a minor footnote in some course that was something like, wolves are Jehovah's Witnesses because they teach false doctrine, or Mormons, or anybody doesn't agree with us. Those are wolves because those are false teachers and they're false prophets, which they're prophets. Since we didn't believe in prophets, all prophets are false prophets, all prophets were wolves. So, and that was it. Nothing else to be said. Let's get on to something important. When Jesus makes this, Paul makes this a fundamental. And we need to understand why modern churchianity does not make it a fundamental. Because that's a sign of a much deeper issue in terms of our understanding what the Bible says. So this should be required, and of course it will be required here at Kingdom Leadership Institute, because your degree in practical ministry means you're going to be able to identify wolves and deal with wolves. And wow, isn't that going to be fun? So a wolf is more than just somebody that teaches something you don't agree with. False teaching. That's not even a good definition of a wolf. In that scenario, everyone who disagrees with you is a wolf. Then everybody's going to be a wolf, because not everybody's going to agree with you. And so then, people just go wild on that and just accuse everybody of being a wolf. Now, I've dealt with wolves. I've identified and dealt with wolves. Had I done the research I've done for this seminar, there's a couple other people I would have dealt with as wolves that I did not deal with them as if they were wolves. But I have done so before, and I'll speak from experience, in other words, and some expertise, because, I don't want to talk about how to identify wolves and deal with them if I've never done it, but I have, and that leads me to this point. But I do not think that every person who disagrees with me is a wolf, by any means. And so we're not going to go down that road where we exaggerate a point. Nor is this going to solve all the problems you've ever had or ever will have as a kingdom leader. See, it's easy. Dr. Don said, people disagree with me are wolves, so we just call everybody a wolf and shoot them. So, no, that's not what we're going to do. Because wolf is specific. It's a behavior that needs to be identified. And the other thing that's happened, and I'll get to this in a moment, is that evangelicalism, by saying false teachers are wolves and I will teach the sheep so they recognize wolves, completely short-circuited what the Bible said, because they said, I'll teach you, the sheep, to recognize wolves, when the Bible says your job as a shepherd is to identify and deal with the wolves, not the sheep. So we've completely confused what Jesus said in order to hammer his teaching into our own definition of churchanity. Once you leave kingdom out of church and church out of kingdom, you end up with church being whatever you want it to be. And so in church growthism, you see, we now celebrate wolves because we actually think wolf behavior is a key and secret to success in church growth. So anybody ready now to, let's just go ahead and define what a wolf is. Let's get a basic definition of what is the wolf behavior. We know they dress up like sheep so they get close to them, to isolate them. But here is the most fundamental definition of a wolf is they consume sheep, but they don't actually eat them. This word consume doesn't mean, they actually gnaw on them and, so that the sheep end up, just bones. No, they maintain a wolf den full of sheep because this is a spiritual idiom. Or a spiritual simile or metaphor. So a wolf consumes sheep. A wolf is someone who uses sheep to gratify or satisfy an inner demanding desire within them. I'm consuming sheep. Now, if anybody knows what a shepherd is and does, they know this. And Jesus said, my sheep belong to me. See, that's unusual. That's why he said it. Because most of the time, if you're a shepherd, the sheep don't belong to you. So you don't ever get to eat sheep. And if you trim their wool, it's not for you. Your job is not to enjoy the wool and how much that is worth. And your job is not to enjoy mutton or rack of lamb. You don't eat sheep because you don't belong to you if you're a shepherd. Jesus said, my sheep are mine and they know my voice. But even then, what he meant by that is that during the night, everybody in the region brought all their sheep together in one fold, and they were watched during the night so shepherd could get some rest. So in the morning, he comes to the community or the cultural regional sheepfold, and when he walks up to the gate, he becomes the gate. That's what he meant. In other words, they're not going to jump over any fences. The only way my sheep are getting out of this sheepfold when I come in the morning is through me. That's what he meant. I'm becoming a gate. And then he said, my sheep know my voice. I know them, and they know my voice. So he knew the sheep, and then he would say, he'd just start talking, and they would recognize his voice. He's talking about bonding, spiritual bonding. And then the sheep would recognize his voice, and the sheep would come toward him, and he would move out, and then he would know his sheep, so he wouldn't leave till he had all his. He said, I know how many sheep I have, and I know what they look like. Familiarity, but that comes from bonding, so they would know his voice. And then he would take them out to pasture, take them out to water, take them out to rest, because he was a good shepherd. But if they were attacked by a wolf, he would get between the sheep and the wolf, and he would risk his life for the sheep, and that's what he meant. A good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Now, in that scenario, listen carefully, because it'll blow up about 3/4 of your sermons on the good shepherd. He's not talking about the cross in that moment. Later on he will. But right then when he says a shepherd lays down his life, he's not saying the cross. What he's saying is that a good shepherd serves the sheep in the sense that he'll risk his life for the sheep. If he's not willing to do that, he's just in it for the money, and he's a hireling. And that's that's not what I want in my kingdom. I don't want hirelings. In other words, Jesus said, I don't want you to accumulate believers because that's a form of success, whether financially, emotionally, professionally, or whatever it motivates you as a kingdom leader. If you just want to amass a group of people who follow you around to satisfy or gratify an internal need of your own, remember, they're not your sheep, and you're eating them, you're gnawing on them. In other words, you're using them to satisfy and gratify an inner need. Now, as we see how this plays out, we'll understand something about ecclesia that we've forgotten. We'll understand something about kingdom leadership we've forgotten or didn't know. And we'll understand something about our relationship and responsibility to, as kingdom leaders, to the people of God and the citizens of the kingdom that we need to be aware of as we enter the new era of Reformation. Modern churchianity approach to woe is just keep attending here at megachurch, and you'll not be distracted. Your protection is all about you continuing to attend the events. As if sheep went to the fair once a week, they'd never be eaten by wolves. See, you would expect to find some scriptures in the Bible that would explain wolf and sheep behavior in terms of modern church growth, and it doesn't. It doesn't even make sense to hammer this into church growthism. It's pretty much impossible to protect sheep from wolves as someone needs to know them well personally in modern church. That's what Jesus said. I know my sheep. Well, modern church growthism, mega church, people don't know sheep. Believe me, I've been on the staff of them. I've been asked staff meetings like, well, how do you know if somebody's a member of your church? We don't have membership. How do you know if they even come here? Well, they give them offering. That's the only way we know. I said, you mean if somebody doesn't give an offering, you don't even know they were here? And he's like, right. Well, I'm back, those people are vulnerable to wolves. That's not anything at all like what Jesus is talking about. They say, well, that's the sheep's problem. The sheep need to decide what they want to do. See, that's the second problem with modern church growthism, is that we have made church attendance into the sheep make up their mind model. If you don't like that one, go down to this one. See, if you understand, that's why now wolves thrive, because wolves will learn the lesson. If you want to attract some sheep, just give them what they want. And nobody will stop you from wolf behavior because you look like the success that church growthism is expecting. But you can still use the sheep for your own purposes and gratify your own inner need. You can get identity from ministry, in other words, and in doing so, that's wolf behavior. I would think by now we're getting some questions from some people about what I'm talking about, perhaps. Oh, some amens. Okay, good. Now, wolves are always leaders. That's how wolves function. That's how you identify wolves. They're leaders. Sheep don't have the capacity. Nor did Jesus say that. I mean, Jesus is clear, Paul is clear, Simon is clear, Jude is clear, John is clear, that the wolves they identify are leaders. They weren't always wolves, but they became wolves when they decided that they wanted to have the right or authority to use sheep to fulfill some demanding desire. There's something inside of kingdom leaders that become wolves. They need people to need them. They need people to do what they tell them to do. They have a need. You see, here in the Kingdom Center, when we're training leaders, if we have leaders that have a need to be in charge, then we know they're not ready. Because that's why Jesus said, that's not how it is in the kingdom. You want to be number one, then, come in last. If you want to be, if you want to be first, then, that's not how you get there. If you want to sit on the right hand and the left, then understand that even Jesus can't give you that. That's the whole point he's trying to make, is that if you strive, you fail. If you surrender, you succeed. And he's talking about leaders. Here, let me show you how to be a leader. I'm going to wash your feet. That's what he means by that. He doesn't mean that, if you're pastor of the church, it's your job to mow the grass and clean the toilets because you're washing feet. That's not what that means at all. What he means by that, because Jesus didn't do those things. See, Jesus is busy. He knows his assignment. He's not washing windows, in between miracles. When Paul did so, he explains why he had a job and explains why he was doing so. And then he apologized for doing it because it wasn't a good idea, because it spoiled the Corinthians into entitlement mentalities. And he's like, well, I guess I didn't do you guys any favor. you know, I almost killed myself trying to take care of myself when you should have been taking care of me, and I stole from other, he said, I stole from other churches who are supporting me because you got, you know, to help you guys out. And look at this mess. Now you're divided and you're immature and immoral, and now you don't want to do anything, and you're the greatest thing since sliced bread, and I'm nothing. And I mean, it's literally what Paul says, is that didn't work out very well because you guys didn't learn honor, and I should have taught you some honor. And he tries to actually shame them into honoring him a little bit better because of what he did. He had the right to do it, and he did it. But the point I'm making is that leaders who decide that ministry is profession, therefore, if I build a big church, I filled a need of myself. You're not a hero in the kingdom. Now, you might lead thousands, and I know some who are leading ministries of 100,000, and I know people leading ministries of 20,000, and many people I know, leaders are leading ministries of 5,000, and none of them are wolves. Because none of them have a demanding inner desire that people following them is satisfying that need. And when the test comes, they respond like a wolf. They look like sheep, it's clothing, like I'm just one of you guys, until somebody does something they don't like, and then the big teeth come out, and the drool is coming off their, off their teeth, and then they growl, and you're like, oh, woo, yeah, okay. Yeah, you're not a sheep, you're a wolf. You see, in the test, the behavior comes to the surface. Why is the sheep following the wolf? So what is a wolf to sheep, and what is a sheep to a believer? What is the shepherd to the sheep, and what is a shepherd to the wolf? See, in the metaphor, we need all three of these things working according to the meaning of Jesus and Paul and other leaders. As I mentioned, the metaphor is not so pervasive that Jesus means a shepherd is a bigger sheep. I mean, think this through. He's not saying we're all humans in here. Humans are wolves, and humans are sheep, and humans are shepherds. So how do I know the difference between a sheep and a shepherd? Because it's the behavior, it's the role of the shepherd that's different from the behavior or the role of the sheep. The relationship between a shepherd and a sheep is what he's defining. He's not defining the human behavior. He's defining the simile or the metaphor so that I can understand what he means about spiritual reality. He's saying, here's a spiritual reality in my kingdom to help you understand how things work. Things really work in the spirit, how things really work in kingdom culture. Let me use this metaphor. And so he uses the metaphor of sheep and wolves. In other words, Jesus and other leaders do not use the metaphor to speak of wolves as wearing shepherd's clothing, but sheep's clothing. So a wolf consumes the most vulnerable. A wolf doesn't come in and drive off all the sheep. A wolf comes in and gets close to vulnerable sheep. A wolf will consume a lamb because it's easy to get to. Or a wolf will consume the most vulnerable or the sheep most likely to be isolated. A wolf will study the flock, in other words, and then move in quickly on the other side of the flock from the shepherd, because the shepherd's not that stupid. He can see what a wolf would look like if he got close. So the wolf always stays in doing his business in a isolated or on the fringe, and then picks off the vulnerable sheep to satisfy himself. But one won't do. It's like a wolf eats one lamb, but then he has to come back for some more, because one won't do. It's an insatiable inner desire. I have to have people follow me. I have to be, I've already got my cards printed, says pastor, and so I got to have some sheep because I've already printed my cards and said, pastor, I'm called. I got the call of God, so I need to go get some people. So if I don't have any, I'll get somebody else's. I'll go find some sheep And then if you confront them, the first thing they'll say is, well, all the sheep belong to Jesus, and I belong to Jesus, so we're all humans. You forgot the metaphor. Because the shepherd is not a shepherd, and the sheep is a sheep. They're both humans. The reason the shepherd's a shepherd is because Jesus is the one who put them in that position. And that's why Jesus said, if you're a shepherd for any reason other than, or if you're a hireling, you're just doing it for the money. You see what I'm saying? If we just got rid of hirelings, they're wolves. Hirelings are wolves. So in modern churchianity right now in America, let's say all the hirelings quit tomorrow. There'd be a whole bunch of sheep looking for some place to go eat come Sunday. Then let's say all the wolves quit because nobody who is trying to build a ministry to meet a need in their own lives, a need inside of them to satisfy some demanding desire, if they quit, then we'd be down to the representative, radical remnant leaders, and the pioneers would take over, and we would find a totally different looking church, and we'd also find out that a whole bunch of sheep are not really sheep at all. Does that sound a little bit too negative? I mean, is that too scary? Anybody scared? Yeah. I mean, that's why I say about 80% of the ministries here in our region are illegitimate, because the reason they started doesn't have anything to do with Jesus. They started because inside of them, they had a need that needed to be satisfied, and they're satisfying it by surrounding them with some of God's people. All right, questions? I only get 5 more minutes? No way. It's an hour already? A wolf consumes lambs. In 5 minutes, let's cover this part. He wants to draw sheep to himself. He comes from without, or he doesn't come from without, he comes from within. In other words, he's familiar with the sheep, but when he becomes a wolf, he has to change clothes. He has to camouflage. So I want to, after this break, I want to go to Acts chapter 20, and I want to talk about Paul's farewell discussion with the elders of Ephesus, in which he introduces this idea of sheep and wolves. And I want to do that because that is the kingdom flavor of things that we need to look at. Now, Jesus, as I mentioned, uses the good shepherd, and in the first part, he's talking about several metaphors. He's the gate, he's the good shepherd, but he identifies a very specific behavior. I lay down my life for the sheep. Later on, he says that the love of the Father flows through him and flows to the sheep. And my Father loves me. He said, my Father loves me because I lay down my life for the sheep. And so I think we understand what he meant by they're my sheep. I think what he meant was that every shepherd has sheep only by assignment, and that the king, the owner of the sheep, is the one who makes the assignment, and he doesn't go to sheep and ask them what they want. He assigns sheep to shepherds because the shepherds are the ones who represent him. This is normal kingdom. It's the presupposition of Jesus when he's talking about the good shepherd, is not that human beings just believers run around and find something they like, because I can't think of a worse behavior. If we're trying to protect you from sheep from the wolf, protect you from a wolf is that you just run around and find what you want, because the whole point of you having a shepherd is that you're not the one who can protect yourself from the wolf. And now Paul's going to hammer that point home so powerfully that it's undeniable. It's undeniable that Jesus, the originating apostles, the Bible clearly presupposes, designs, and defines the role of shepherd, sheep, and wolf in such a way that the protection of the sheep doesn't come in the sheep selecting their own shepherd, but in the shepherd being assigned sheep and laying down his life for them. So we'll come back to that after a break. You had some things you wanted to share, Victoria? Well, come, please, and share them. Glad to see everybody here. And those of you that joined us, please enter in and make comments and send questions. Victoria. Yeah, well.